There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode contains discussions of violence perpetrated towards children. Listener discretion is advised. It's a sunny Saturday afternoon in spring 1930. Mena Griffiths is 12 years old and living with her family in suburban Melbourne. There's a park she often visits with her friends, and she asks her parents if she can go out and play. Her parents can't know that there's a man sitting at a local hotel bar. He's about 30 years old. He's known to the community as a family man, with a wife named Bernice and a baby named Joan. At 18, he had been sent to a reformatory prison for theft. Shortly after his release, he was sent back to prison for armed robbery and wounding a station master. They can't know that his crimes are on the verge of becoming more extreme, and that as he watches the young girls play in the nearby park, he decides to finish his drink and approach the little girl. They can't know that what he does will only be the beginning. He will go on to commit a series of crimes so horrific that he will be hanged at Pentridge Prison. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Catherine Kovacic, the author of the Schoolgirl Strangler. Catherine is an art historian and author who works with a variety of museums, galleries and historic houses. It's the 8th of November 1930 when a young girl named Mena Griffiths asks to go to the park with her siblings. What do her parents say? Because it's a bit of a different time. Are they comfortable with that?
I think they were quite comfortable. Mena was 12, and it was a big family. She had responsibility for her younger siblings, but it was a Saturday afternoon. It was a sunny afternoon. There were lots of people about playing cricket on the oval, people watching the cricket, and other children in the playground, and it wasn't far from home. So I think they were quite comfortable with the idea of the kids being out and about.
And what happened once she got there? She was approached by a man. What do her siblings remember about what he looked like and what happened?
Well, she'd gone with three of her siblings, three sisters, and they were all playing, well, together but not together, I guess, as sisters do when they're of different ages. You know, you're 12, you're sort of getting a little bit older and you don't want to have all the responsibility all the time when you're hanging out with your own friends. But she was approached by a man and he asked her to run an errand for him or, as they said at the time, to go a message. And she refused at first, but he asked again and said he'd give her some money and he'd also give her siblings some money too if she would do this errand for him. And I think being a child of that day, if adults asked you to do something and you were reasonably comfortable, you did as you were told.
And so she went off with the man. When she didn't return, her siblings went home. Were her parents initially concerned when she didn't return home with them?
At first they weren't. You know, it was summer, the days were a bit longer. Sometimes the kids, when they'd been out playing, they lost track of time. They met some other children and played on. And so at first, this was just sort of, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Her parents weren't too concerned. They just assumed that she'd gotten delayed or forgotten what time it was and would turn up fairly soon. At
what point did her parents start to worry that something more serious had happened?
Well, they'd been told by one of the siblings that she would run an errand for a strange man. And by the time, it was probably getting close to 6 o'clock, around probably what was dinner time for the family then, her father decided he needed to go out and check. So they were getting anxious at that stage, but they were still just thinking that something had happened. Perhaps she'd fallen and hurt herself or just been delayed in some way. So they were going out to look. But at this stage, they weren't really panicking. They were just more concerned.
Had anyone else in the neighbourhood that they spoke to seen this interaction, seen her speak to the man? Were there any descriptions of him?
At the time when the family were first out searching, there was nothing other than what their daughter, Joyce, the second daughter, had told them. But later on, descriptions would come out of this man, and it was really quite scary, really. It was sort of like childhood nightmare things, scars on the face and dirty and blackened teeth and a shuffling, limping gait, real bogeyman sort of stuff.
And how long before her body was found?
It was actually found the next day, but it was found several suburbs away in an abandoned house.
And how did those men who found the body actually come across it?
Well, they were just two young guys, sort of 19-ish, and they were out looking for goldfinches, as it happens, which is a very obscure thing to be doing, but they were getting paid money to find young birds to be sold in a pet shop. They were walking past this abandoned house, and they'd been past it several times. But boys being boys, they thought today they'd have a bit of an investigate. And they went round the back of the house but they found what was called a tradesman's cupboard. So this was sort of a cupboard that runs through from either the back porch or, in this case, the laundry into the kitchen, whereby perhaps the grocer could come round, and if the homeowners weren't there, he could leave things in his side of the cupboard. It sort of had a door on either side. And then when the homeowner came back, they could open the door on their side and take things in. And this cupboard was lying open on both sides, so it provided a way into the house. And once again, boys being boys, here was a great chance to have a little sticky beak. So they both went into the house and started looking around, and they found Mena's body lying in the bathroom of this house.
What did the post-mortem examination determine in terms of her cause of death and what had happened to her?
The cause of death was suffocation by strangulation. She had some of her own clothing stuffed into her mouth, but it looked like she had also been manually strangled. She'd been sexually assaulted, but the coroner and the pathologist were unable to say whether that had happened before or after she'd died.
Did they have any leads in regards to who might be responsible? You say that obviously her siblings had seen this man, so they had a bit of a description. Did they have any idea of it maybe being someone close to the family, or were they, at least at the beginning, kind of had no idea where to start?
I don't think they thought it was anyone close to the family, partly based on where the body was found, and also I think the family's immediate actions when Mena went missing. They were frantic once they realised things had gone horribly wrong, and they were out combing the park. So the family doesn't seem to have come under suspicion. And once the news story went out, other witnesses began to come forward about seeing the girl and a man, a lot of obviously incorrect witnesses as it happened, but some that helped the police work out how these people had travelled, but not who the man was. So what the police did, as I guess they probably still do today, is they started to look at their known criminals, men who had histories of sexual assault, of interest in young children, and they particularly paid attention to the lists of men recently released from prison on these crimes. And so that was where they started, and that was where they felt they had their first big lead.
And they came up with the name Robert James McMahon, and he was arrested. What evidence did they have that he was the man responsible?
Essentially none, except that he was one of those guys who'd been released from prison literally 2 weeks before this occurred. He vaguely fitted the description, but at the same time, this was 1930, so Great Depression, a lot of men out of work, a lot of, I guess, what we'd call swagmen or tramps, itinerant travellers, so men who, while not necessarily fitting the full-on black teeth, sores and scars description, would look shabby and disreputable. There were a lot of guys like that around, and Robert McMahon was one of them after his immediate release from prison. And that was really all they had against him.
So while he was in custody a few months after, 16-year-old Hazel Wilson accompanied a friend to the train station. What was she planning on doing after that?
She was planning on going straight home. She'd like to go out with this particular friend, but on that evening it was going to be a quiet evening in, so it was straight back home for Hazel that night. She
didn't end up coming home, but her parents weren't too worried at first. Was she someone who would ordinarily, say, go and stay at a friend's house or something?
Absolutely. So Hazel was 16. She was petite. She was only just over 5 feet, and she had a chronic illness that ultimately she wouldn't have lived a very long life. So Hazel, she was a girl who was determined to get the most out of her life. So yes, she would often go and stay at a friend's house. She would often go out to dances and things which her very straight-laced parents weren't huge fans of. They thought, she should be home being a good girl at all times. So the fact that she didn't come home, they automatically assumed that rather than seeing this friend off at the train station, she'd decided she'd go and stay the night with this friend instead.
So they weren't alarmed when they went to bed that night, but in bed they did hear something strange and look out the window. What did they see that night?
Well, that's very convoluted. There seemed to be 3 different versions of what they saw that night, and it seemed to depend whether you were talking to Hazel's father or the neighbour that Hazel's father supposedly told a story to, or the police that Hazel's father supposedly told a different story to. So at one stage, the neighbour, I believe it was, said that he'd been told that the parents had seen Hazel standing with a man or a boy at the front fence around midnight. The parents themselves maintained that they'd heard a noise and gone to have a look, and it was either a stray dog in the street or a man carrying a parcel. So there's a lot of mystery around what they saw.
They woke up the next morning and kind of grew more concerned when they realised she hadn't come home at all that night and hadn't come home that morning, and began to search. They found a shoe and then started widening their search around the neighbourhood. What did they end up finding?
They found some drag marks in the street, or what they believed to be drag marks, as though someone's heels had trailed through the dirt. So this was an unmade street. Just across the end of their street, in a vacant lot, they found Hazel's body.
Had she been killed in a similar way to the previous victim?
She hadn't been sexually assaulted, but she had been strangled in the same way, and once again, some of her own clothing had been stuffed into her mouth.
And had any witnesses seen her? So she's dropped the friend off at the train station. Did anyone see her with anyone, or were there any kind of sightings?
There were a lot of sightings. It was a busy evening. There were lots of people out and about, and Hazel was well known in the neighbourhood. So some young gentlemen passed her walking on the street. She asked them for a cigarette, and they knew her by sight. Some other people standing on a street corner saw her go past. And one group of people saw her go past, this time accompanied by a strange man that none of them had ever seen. But she seemed to be talking and joking and generally just quite relaxed with this man. And then later on, a couple of neighbours thought they saw her when they returned home, lit up in the car headlights. So she was seen by quite a few people on her walk from the train station back to her own home.
What did her death mean for McMahon, who is currently in jail for the initial crime committed against Mena? Was it starting to look like they might have the wrong man?
I think initially it meant absolutely nothing. The police were sure they had the right man for Mena Griffiths' murder, and there had been another completely unrelated murder that fell in between Mena's murder and Hazel Wilson's murder, and it was also in the same suburb. And so I think police were actually initially trying to link Hazel's murder to this third completely unrelated thing, which left them completely good to go with Robert McMahon for Mena's death.
They did start to become suspicious of Hazel's father. Why was that? You suggested before that there was a little bit of a volatile relationship because she was out a lot. What else made them point fingers at Hazel's father?
The overriding thing probably is that they had nothing to go on, and the first thing that police tend to do is look at the close family. So Hazel's father had been known for having a violent temper. Police had been called to the house once or twice. He had been known to be violent towards his wife, but particularly in regard to Hazel, he was very against her going out to dances and things. He felt that it was not appropriate behaviour for a young lady. Several of her friends would later tell police that when they were coming home late at night, Hazel would say she was afraid to go home, which they took to mean afraid of her father. So there was a volatility to the relationship there, which was the driving reason behind police initially looking at Hazel's father for the murder.
So was anyone arrested in relation to Hazel's murder?
No, police were very keen to make a case against Hazel's father, and at the coronial inquest, the finger was pointed squarely at him, but it was felt by the coroner that there wasn't a case to answer there.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Catherine Kovacic, author of the Schoolgirl Strangler. So after Hazel's death, things go quiet for a number of years and it looks like that murder is unsolved. And then on New Year's Day in 1935, there's a 12-year-old girl named Ethel Belshaw. What was she doing that day?
Ethel Belshaw was at Inverloch. Inverloch is a coastal town in Victoria and they have a New Year's Day festival, a beach festival. So she had travelled with some neighbours from the small town where she lived, which was called Tarwin Meadows, and they'd come to the beach festival accompanying the daughter of that family. There were a couple of adults, or probably about 4 adults in the group, and her friend's older brother was also there. So they were there just for a day of swimming at the beach. There was a sort of a carnival, so all those sort of activities, a fashion parade, a Miss Inverloch parade, and various sort of sporting games, swimming competitions and things like that.
And she ended up going off with a friend, didn't she?
Yes, she did. So Ethel and the young friend, they went to get an ice cream late in the afternoon, and the two of them went to the main shop in Inverloch. They were in a long queue and Ethel was served first, so she went outside to wait. But when her school friend came out to find her, she'd gone.
And when the school friend returned and Ethel's family was there, were they concerned that she appeared to have disappeared, and did it kind of start this frenzied search?
Well, immediately they were told to go and have another look for her, but essentially it was a beach carnival. It was a sunny, happy day. There were probably estimates of between 15 and 18,000 people there having a great time. It was a 10-minute walk between where the family had set up their picnic. So they just once again assumed that Ethel had somehow gotten caught up with something. She knew where they were. She knew what time they were due to leave. So they thought if they all had a cup of tea, a bit of a sandwich, a bit of a snack, by the time they were done and getting ready to pack up and go home, Ethel would have turned up.
Had anyone seen her after she'd gone missing from the front of that shop? Were there any sightings?
Later on, there were once again several people who came forward and said they'd seen her. Again, this was very confused because there seemed to be a couple of girls who looked similar to Ethel and witnesses thought that they'd seen her but had seen this other girl. There were a couple of people who seemed to be more credible witnesses who saw Ethel with a young man. And there was someone who had known Ethel's family from working in the district previously who'd seen Ethel earlier in the day, so probably about an hour or two before the ice cream, and had seen her and spoken to her and sent her on her way after sending his regards to the family, essentially.
How long was it before they ended up recovering Ethel's body?
Ethel's body was found the next day.
And were there again these similarities in terms of the method and how she'd been killed?
Absolutely. So she was positioned in the same way as Hazel. So on her face with her hands tied behind her back, she had some of her clothing stuffed into her mouth and another piece of her clothing had been tied around that gag to hold it in place.
They interviewed a number of witnesses about, as you say, having spoken to Ethel or seen her that afternoon. And one of those witnesses was a man named Arnold Soderman. What did he say he saw that day? He'd actually spoken to her, hadn't he?
That's right, yes. So Arnold Soderman used to work at Tarwin Meadows, so he knew the family. And he, like Ethel's group, had come to Inverloch for the day. He was there with his wife and child and some of their neighbours and friends from Leongatha, where he lived now. And he had been sitting with a member of his travelling party and seen Ethel with her friend going past, and he'd called out to her and said hello and said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "Well, we're here for the beach carnival." But she was wearing her bathing suit. They'd been swimming and she shivered. And he said, "Oh, you look cold." And so she said, "Yes, I think I'll go and get changed now. Ta-ta." And off she went. And that was the last he saw of her.
Afterwards, there was a fourth case, and that was with a girl named Joan Rushmer. What happened to her? She was with a friend also, wasn't she?
Yes, once again, June was playing with a group of friends in the local park. This was December, so again, longer days, and it was about 7 o'clock in the evening, and she said, "Oh, got to go home." So her friends saw her walk out the gates of the park and turn in the direction of home, and once again, she never made it home.
Her body was found, and again, it was in this, there had been, a similar killing to what had happened with Ethel and Hazel and Mena. By this point, had police put together that these crimes were all related? Because the idea of a serial killer was almost unheard of in those days.
Yeah, and I think that was what had really hampered the police, the idea of someone who just kills for the sake of killing. And with the great spacing, that gap of years, I think that sort of threw a spanner into the works. But by this stage, I think they were definitely knew that they were looking for the same killer. There was some sort of, play in the media about, well, the knots here were tied differently to the knots there, so perhaps it was just someone trying to throw police off the scent. But that seems to have been more of a media guise than anything else, and I think the police definitely knew they were looking for the same killer.
Something strange happened in the wake of June's death, and that was a conversation that actually happened at a work site. A bunch of labourers were talking about what had happened, and one of the road workers made an offhanded comment about, actually, I thought I saw you there. I thought that I saw you on a bike or in the area of where she'd gone missing. What was the response of the man who had sort of been accused at that point?
Well, this was the thing that really blew the case wide open, because this normally mild-mannered worker, when his colleague said to him quite jokingly, I thought I saw you on a bicycle that night, and by this stage a bicycle had become a major clue in the June Rushmer case. Instead of laughing it off or just brushing it aside, as I think his colleagues expected him to do, he exploded, "No, you bloody didn't," and he stormed off. And it was so out of character that the guy who'd posed the question, it just got him thinking, because he knew he'd seen this man. And so this group of workers, they were road workers at a sort of remote campsite, he went straight back into town and told the police that there was something funny going on there.
And when the police interviewed this suspect, his name, Arnold Soderman, there was one link that we spoke about prior, which is that he did say he'd spoken to Ethel on the day that she'd disappeared. But the police had actually spoken to him before. What other connections did he have with some of the girls who had gone missing?
Well, they'd spoken to him about Ethel, and he had actually appeared at the inquest to give that story about seeing her and then seeing her go. But in terms of connections to the other girls, at that stage they didn't really know that he had any, except when they started to look into his past, they found out that he hadn't always been living up at Leongatha and Inverloch. He'd lived back in Melbourne, and in fact he'd lived close to where the body of Mena Griffiths was found, which was only a couple of kilometres from where Hazel Wilson lived. So when they really started to look, they found that this guy really fitted the bill.
When they began interviewing him, he cracked pretty quickly. Did he confess to the murder of all 4 girls to police officers?
Yes, he did. He did. Once they really hammered him on the June Rushmer case, once he knew he was gone for that, he said, "She's not the only one. There are 3 others." And then he gave them all the details about the other 3 cases.
And when he began to confess, did he give details as to how he coaxed these girls and what those final moments looked like? How was he able to manipulate them or take them off? Was it because with a few of them, like even Ethel, he was familiar?
He had not met Mena Griffiths before, and he hadn't met Hazel Wilson before, but he seems to be a man who could be quite charming and could gain people's trust. And as he would actually say at a later point, it could just as easily be adults if I could get them to walk away with me. So he seemed to be able to just turn it on and say the right thing. So for Mena, it was, "I'll give you some money if you come with me," and then he bought her fish and chips. For Ethel, it was a case of they'd known each other. For June, it was, "I'll give you a ride on my bicycle." So he just seemed to be able to find that thing, that one thing, that would let these people trust him.
And what kind of man was Arnold? Did he live up to that description of the blackened teeth and the scars? Was he what the initial descriptions had of him?
Absolutely not. It's almost the serial killer trope, isn't it? He was the man next door. He looked perfectly normal. The neighbours in Leongatha described him as a quiet, pleasant man. People who'd known him in the recent past knew him as a very pleasant man. He was married with a wife and an 8-year-old daughter of his own. He had had trouble in his past as in his late teens and early 20s, and he had served time in prison. So I think the police perhaps would have had a different view of the sort of person that he was. But to all intents and purposes, he was a very nice man.
And what was he like to his wife and daughter? Did they have any suspicions that he was this man wreaking havoc on the community?
They knew absolutely nothing. In his wife's eyes, he was a perfect husband and provider, and she was devastated, doesn't even begin to describe it. She was disbelieving. There are letters written when he was first arrested, and she is begging with him, I can't believe it. Tell me the truth, because I've got friends and neighbours ready to stand by to put money in on your defence, but I need to know the truth. And she just could not reconcile the idea that the man she was married to was this man that they were talking about in the papers.
He'd had quite a traumatic childhood. What had happened in his past that might have explained this incredible anger he had?
Well, he did say later, he told prison officials that he had been beaten as a child. We don't have sort of confirming evidence of that. His brother didn't say that he had been beaten as a child, but then perhaps no one actually asked him about his childhood, because that perhaps wouldn't fit the narrative that the people asking the questions wanted to come up with. So Arnold Soderman himself did say that he had been beaten badly as a child. He ran away once when he was quite young, so probably about 12, but came back very quickly. He ran away a second time, but that was to join the army for World War I. The description of him when he ran away that time didn't really suggest that he would have been fooling any of the enlistment officers, because he was essentially a short, pimply-faced youth at the time. So I don't think he could have passed himself off as 21, which was the enlistment age then. Later on, it would come out that his grandfather had had potentially some violent episodes. But it's a bit hard to say whether he had a traumatic childhood or whether that was just part of the narrative that they wanted to come up with later on.
And what did they discover about his mental health and his relationship to alcohol when they pressed him and when he revealed some of the circumstances around his crimes?
Well, when his lawyers started to put together the case, they interestingly introduced all the cases into evidence on the grounds that he was essentially insane and that alcohol brought on these episodes of uncontrolled murderous impulse, whereby he could murder someone not knowing what he was doing at the time, and then his brain fog would clear and he would be left wondering quite what had happened, but then seeing the body in front of him would realise. So they were painting a picture of a man with a mental instability that was triggered by alcohol.
What was he sentenced to when he faced a court?
He was sentenced to death, so a capital punishment, death by hanging in Victoria at that stage.
And finally, I wanted to ask, when he was killed, they did a sort of examination and discovered that he had a degenerative disease. Do you think that could have contributed to his behaviour? I
don't think so. The post-mortem was carried out by one of the doctors who had testified that he potentially had a mental illness. The findings were perhaps more consistent simply with someone who had been hanged remaining on the noose effectively for the standard 30 minutes afterwards, so congestion in the brain. In fact, in the post-mortem, it described an acute change in the brain. So short-term, even if that had happened, we're talking about murders over a 5-6 year span, so acute changes can't really account for a 6-year murderous spree.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jessie.
Catherine Kovacic is the author of the new book, The Schoolgirl Strangler, available at all good bookshops. You can find a link to Catherine's book in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri, and our executive producer is Gia Moylan. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.